All right. So we are up and running. This is our fourth session that we have been meeting. And sorry for those of you that are tuning in for starting a few minutes late. But Jewish time is what it is. We've been discussing time for the whole first first three sessions. We're going to be discussing in a slightly different way the concept of when certain things are done. All right, so far we have focused on the main topic of the Shema. And this has really been a foundation, not just about the Shema, but in general for many of the principles of Judaism and Jewish law, especially, not surprisingly, as relates to prayer, since we are in Masechet Berachot. We are in the tractate of Berachot, of blessings. And we've talked about the way the timing works, so that there are certain times of the day when doing the Shema is a mitzvah, and there are other times of the day when doing the Shema is just reading. And we have talked about the idea most recently of intention, that sometimes the words can come out, but if you didn't mean them, then it doesn't count. Or sometimes there are times when you will be unable to fulfill the mitzvah, even if you have the opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah. The case that we went over was the issue of the bridegroom, that the bridegroom on the wedding night doesn't really have his head in the game for saying the Shema with the proper kavanah, the proper intention. And we are going to continue that concept of who gets to say the Shema and when. And I have a sneaky suspicion we're going to spend a lot of time on one Mishnah in particular, but we'll see how that goes. Okay, so I wanted to get back to the concept that we introduced and went over a little bit last time, with the idea that this is our 0 point, and that every day there are certain mitzvot that we start off here. And when we fulfill them, we are yotze, right? Remember the concept that we are then coming out of our obligation, we have fulfilled our duty, and now we are square. Right, where we're in the black pen. We're going to be talking more today, a little bit like we did last week, which is when do I and when do I not have that debt? And the words that we're going to use in Hebrew, we'll use the translation mostly, are patur and chayav. Right, so patur means that one is exempt. Right, it means this debt for this day, for this moment, these circumstances, this person, whatever it might be, is nullified. You are not obligated to do it. Right? You are patur. You are exempt from this. You are free. It's like someone paid off your credit card bill this month, so don't worry about it. You're okay. Sometimes being exempt is a temporary circumstance. Think the bridegroom we talked about in last week's class. Sometimes it is a more long-standing status, which is going to be a big part of our discussion tonight. The opposite of exempt is chayav, right? And chayav, obligated, is probably our easiest English word for translating it, right? So chayav means you have an obligation, right? And this was very much in keeping with the idea of that the chiyuv is your debt. It is your obligation. You owe it, in this particular case, to yourself and to existence, to fulfill this act, and therefore you are obligated. So remember, exempt and obligated as being our dichotomy that we're going to be playing with in today's discussion. All right. So Harriet, I know you love reading, and this is your last week with us before you go back up to the great hot north.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Well, usually you're going back up to the great white north. Now you're going back to the great hot north.
Oh,
yeah. Would you like to read?
I'd love to. Thank you.
Okay. So we are on Berachot, chapter 3, Mishnah 1. It's right on the front page of the handout.
At the end of the last chapter, we learned that some people might be exempt from reciting the Shema
Patur.
because they couldn't have proper intention. There, the Mishnah referred to the bridegroom's celebrating his wedding night. The first two Mishnayot of the third chapter deal with exemptions due to participation in a funeral.
All right, so that's the introduction. The Mishnah text itself begins where it says Mishnah 1.
One whose dead relative lies before him is exempt from the recital of the Shema and from the Tefillah and from Tefillin.
All right. So, as always, tiny little words we have to unpack. Right? It's amazing how much information you can get into such a compressed space. So somebody who's dead is before them. Not exactly the euphemism we would use in modern English, but this is speaking very formally about a particular moment in time, right? So here's the conflicting lines, right? This is a pen that's dying. This is a timeline, right? Somebody dies here, and somebody is buried there, right? This is the time period we are talking about, right? Trying to write two words with one letter. Dead before. Right? The body is still there in front of you. Now, in classical times and in Israel to this day, this period is hopefully measured in hours, right? Well, 24 is a little arbitrary, but the idea is that it should be done as expeditiously as serves the honor of the deceased. Sometimes that means a slight delay in order to allow distant relatives to come, but it doesn't mean you're measuring this in weeks. Right? So when we say that you are exempt during this period while your deceased are still unburied, have in mind an hours type of window. Maybe a day and a half, but we're not talking much longer than that.
I never really understood that until 10 years ago when my mother died. It was like 3 o'clock in the morning and I was in the hospital with her. And I knew that our synagogue had morning minyan at 6:30. And I said, that's what I'm going to do. David stayed with her and I went to minyan. And I sat there, Rabbi, there was no way I could have said any of the prayers at that moment in time. I never would have believed that that would be the case. I could not focus on it. It was great to be in the company of people.
Right.
But they're right. You can't have any intention the prayers at that point in time.
Okay, which brings us back to why, even though we might be normally obligated for Shema, Tefillah, remember Tefillah is a synonym for the Amidah, the main section of prayer in conversation with God, and Tefillin, the mitzvah of wearing Tefillin. Normally we're obligated to those every day, some of them multiple times a day. During this period, we are exempt. Right? During this period, someone else is picking up the tab, so to speak, and just as Harry had mentioned, it's primarily because we don't have the presence of mind to be able to fulfill these obligations. Therefore, there's no point in asking us to show up to, in quote, do them. Because even if we can utter the words, we still won't be doing it the way that it's meant to be done. So better to just be exempt. And there's another reason why we are exempt, a more practical reason. This is a very intrinsic reason, an internal reason, but there's also an external reason why we are exempt during this time.
Tameh.
Because you're tameh? Not necessarily, because you may or may not have been there when the person passed away, so you may or may not have become ritually impure. And in general, you still have these obligations while you are in a standard version of ritual impurity. We're going to come back to that later tonight. But there are practical concerns, right? Between when the deceased has passed and when the deceased is buried, you are supposed to be taking care of them, right? You are preparing them for burial. You are keeping the shmirah, the guard over them, and you are preparing the ground. Remember, this is back in the days before you had a backhoe and you had a full burial society that would take everything for you, and the hospital would take care of this. The person would be in your house, and they would be lying wherever it was, whatever room they had died, and you would prepare them there, and then from the house you would go to the cemetery. So as hard as you can imagine it would be to pray knowing that your loved one is in the hospital, imagine how hard it would be to pray knowing they're in your house and that you are responsible for taking care of them. And there is a million things that need to be done to provide them with the proper kavod, the proper honor for their burial. So both for you as well as for the deceased, you're exempt. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay, that's one line.
Wow.
Line 2.
The bearers of the bier and their replacements and their replacement's replacement both those in front of the bier and those behind the bier. Those needed to carry the bier are exempt, but those not needed to carry the bier are not exempt.
Okay, so long ago, in days of yore, we did not have a hearse, right? And you would need to carry the body from the home to the cemetery. And chances were the cemetery was not next door. It was probably some distance. And that meant that you had pallbearers, what we call them in the modern lingo. You had people that would carry the funeral bier to the cemetery. While you are carrying the person, the time for Shema could be passing. Can I say the Shema while I am carrying the person? Now, this is not necessarily my relative. This is just somebody that I am helping to lay to rest. So my mind is not necessarily distracted because of my grief, but it's time for the Shema, and I'm carrying the body.
Last week, I couldn't say it if I were up in the tree picking fruit because I'm busy with something else at the same time. So this may be sort of on the same road.
Actually, the Shema you could.
Oh,
the Amidah you couldn't.
That's right, you had to stand.
Right. So, and here, the Shema you can't say while walking.
Right.
But it's not that you can't say the Shema while walking. In fact, you can if necessary. You're part of a caravan or something, and you need to keep moving to be part of the group for safety and whatnot. You can say the Shema and even the Amidah while walking. It's not preferred or ideal. And we're going to get to the whole rules of the Amidah in next chapter, chapter 4. But here, I'm carrying it, and there's a guy next to me to take over when I get tired, because this is a difficult job, and there's a guy to take over for him when he gets tired, right? My replacement, and my replacement, we are all exempt. They do not need to be involved because they are already involved in this mitzvah of carrying the deceased. So they are exempt. But other people who are in the procession walking, they are not exempt. And that doesn't mean that they should all run off and go back to the synagogue and do the Shema there. It just means that while walking, they can say the Shema to themselves as the procession goes along. Make sense? Maybe? Okay, so again, we're focusing on what are you doing, what can you do at this moment, and how do we balance the two? And Judaism is infinitely practical.
Both, however, are exempt from saying tefillah.
Okay, remember again up on our tree, as you reminded us, the Shema, because it is a very familiar scriptural passage, because there is no improvisation, it is a straight quote. You can say that under more difficult circumstances than you could the Amidah, which in the ancient world had more improvisation, more personal expression, and would require a person to formulate their words with greater care because they were formulating the words. They weren't just reciting them. They weren't just remembering what to say. They had to express themselves. Again, that's something that is often lost in the modern version when we have the Siddur. Many people feel that the prayer is said when you've just recited the words. If you don't make the words your own, either by adding to them or by inflecting them with your emotion, you haven't really done the depth of prayer that you should have been doing. Okay, so make sense for this so far? Right, so now we got another clarification of who is exempt and who's not exempt, both for the Shema and for the Tefillah.
And Mishnah 2, when they have buried the dead and returned from the grave, if they have time to begin and finish the Shema before they get to the row, they should begin. But if not, they should not begin.
Okay, the row? Who? Whose row?
The street.
Not their street. Who's been to a funeral that I've conducted or other traditional funerals? What happens immediately after the body has been buried in the earth and the funeral has been concluded right there at the grave? You form two rows. You form two lines, right? So from the, and pardon my drawing, right? From the grave, that's a grave, that's a hole in the ground, right? You end up with two lines of people, and the mourners pass between them on their way home, right? We're familiar with this concept, and that way the mourners can now extend their condolences to the one who grieves. Traditionally, we don't extend the formal condolences of Judaism, the Hamakom Yenachem Etchem, until after the burial has taken place and the person can then truly begin to grieve. Because prior to that, when they were in that position of being an onen, of that time between death and burial, they're not ready to hear condolences because they're focused on the needs of the deceased and their grief is still too raw. Now that this is finished, we immediately begin to offer those formal condolences and everything else that goes along with it. So the question in this Mishnah is, I am here at the graveside as part of the group helping with the burial or paying my respects. The deceased has been lowered. I still haven't said Shema yet. If I have time, let's say time T, to do the Shema between where I am here and getting into the row, do it. If I don't have time, right, if the time is less than the time it takes to do the Shema, then we don't do the Shema until we've been in the row, and after the mourner goes by, sorry, I just got to the second half of the Mishnah. After the mourner goes by, then we do the Shema once they've left. Harry, go ahead and read part two.
Those who stand in the row, those on the inside are exempt, but those on the outside are liable.
Sorry, that actually was a different point. I didn't jump the gun too much.
No, you didn't.
I didn't jump the gun, right? So the second part here is saying if you have, and I'm not going to draw completely, if you have two rows of those who are comforting the mourners, so doing the mitzvah of nichum avilim, the people at the back who can't directly interact with the mourners, because they are not directly providing the comfort and words of comfort, they can, if necessary, to fulfill the obligation of saying the Shema before the time has elapsed that you're supposed to say it from the back row, quietly, each person to him or herself. Make sense? Right? People in front, they are occupied with the mitzvah of the mourner. People in the back are not. And apparently, to go back to our first phrase in the Mishnah, apparently offering comfort to the mourner takes precedence over saying the Shema at this point. Right? It's not, could you just wait a second? I just need to say the Shema real quick. All right, now that I've said the Shema, may God comfort you. You flip it the other way around. If I've got time while I'm walking from grave to form the row, and if you've been to a large funeral, you know that the forming of the row can be quite an extensive ordeal. And certainly if you're going between here and that end of the row, you might absolutely have enough time to say the Shema. And so that's the implication that's being brought here. What do we think? Make sense?
That's nice.
Nice.
That's nice.
But think of the presence of mind and think of what the Mishnah is trying to say about how we view the world. I know it looked a little funny when I put up, the little mathematical T and the less than or equal than sign and all of that. But this is actually what Mishnah in general and Halakha as a whole is trying to help us do, which is to see the world through mitzvah-informed glasses. Who here has seen the movie Terminator? Either the first one or the second one or any of the other ones that came after? No? Or if you've ever seen Top Gun or any movie. What's that?
Gone with the Wind?
Not quite. Any movie or TV show.
We've all seen Gone with the Wind.
Where the protagonists are looking through either glasses or a screen that puts information up about what's out there in the world. Right, so in Terminator, he's looking around and he can identify what car that is, and his little information is popping up. There are many apps now that you can get for your phone. It's called augmented reality, where you can hold up your phone and move it around, and little labels will appear. This direction. Like for example, if you've ever been to Washington D.C., you can do it for the constellations, and it'll tell you, that's Sagittarius over there, and that's Orion, and you just hold it up and move, and the information is overlaid. Right. Over reality, right? It's augmented reality. That's what Mishnah is. That's what Halakha is, right? So that as you're looking and you're seeing, I'm at the graveside and I have obligation to comfort, and the little mourner is haloed, a little light goes around them and says, mitzvah here, comfort. But you also have in your little corner over here a little clock, little sun that's going tick, 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 Shema. and you're looking at this person and the end of the row, and your brain makes the calculation between here and there. Ding, I have time to say the Shema. And so you can begin to say the Shema as you move to take your place, or not enough time, quick, take position, offer comfort, Shema will come next. You're analyzing every situation to see what your action should be. What mitzvah are you obligated to do at this moment? Because by understanding which mitzvah we're obligated to do at the moment, by our analysis of our surroundings, we know what God wants of us at that moment. That's the idea, right? The mitzvot and the analysis of the mitzvot that the Mishnah provides and halacha continues to expand upon is helping us understand at any given time, in any given situation, what it is that God expects of us. Am I exempt? Am I obligated? Right? Am I patur? Am I chayav? And that helps us navigate with this informational overlay the world. So it's not just a world of featureless chairs, tables, and people, but it's people with tags along the side of their presence that tells me what I can do as a mitzvah for this person, what I can do as a mitzvah with this plate of food, what I can do as a mitzvah to something in the environment. It's constantly flagging and tagging opportunities or warnings about how to interact with the world around me. And the Mishnah, by giving us these, perhaps it seems a far-fetched situation of what happens if you're carrying the beer, or however you pronounce that English word, while you're going to the cemetery at the same time you're supposed to be saying the Shema. What are you supposed to? It may seem like it's a bizarre set of circumstances, and God willing, it doesn't come up all that often. But by understanding what we do there, we also can then understand, I've just got a phone call. While I'm trying to say the Shema, do I answer my phone? If you don't know who's calling, of course not. However, if you see that on the phone, that it is a call from somebody you know who's in the hospital, or a call from somebody, God forbid, that you know is near the end of their life, then you should probably postpone saying the Shema and answer the phone. Right? You're navigating it based upon your understanding that, yes, I have this obligation, yes, I have this obligation, and in this set of circumstances, this one takes precedent over this one. But if I'm the replacement of the replacement of the replacement, then it doesn't take precedence, and then I do this one before. That helps you know what you should do. So you don't live in a constant state of either winging it and just, I'll do what I feel, or perpetual paralysis for fear that you'll do the wrong thing. Now, this is trying to clarify the way that we go, which is, of course, what we call halakha. Right? Halakha is the way, right? Or if you want to use the Chinese, it's the Tao of Judaism. Right? This is the way that we live. Okay. Now we get to the fun part.
Yeah.
Okay? Because now we've got this whole idea of this is the way we live, and you're analyzing the whole world and exempt and obligated and all of that. Now let's go for the controversial.
Women, slaves, and minors are exempt from reciting the Shema and putting on tefillin, but are obligated for tefillah, mezuzah, and birkat hamazon, the blessing after meals.
Oh, okay. So good. No one got up and stormed out of the room. That's excellent. Okay, so let's see if we can't figure out what's going on here. Women, slaves, and minors are patur. They are exempt from the recitation of the Shema, and we'll come back to the other parts of the sentence. Why would they be exempt? And what does it mean that they are exempt? All right, let's see if we can figure out the first half, sure, and then we'll do work at the second half. All right, who's been exempt so far?
People in mourning.
People in mourning.
The person in front of you.
Right.
Right.
Or
people consoling the mourners.
People consoling the mourners. Mm-hmm. And last week we also found out about the bridegroom, right? So we'll use those as three, right? So people occupied with the mitzvah of providing comfort, occupied with the mitzvah of burying the deceased, or occupied with the mitzvah of rejoicing with their bride, are exempt from this commandment of the Shema until those things have been completed. Okay? Women, slaves, and minors, how do they fit into that category?
Well, as a woman, I got to tell you, when my baby was crying with hunger and it was time to say the Shema, there was no way I could do that. It was actually a blessing to be exempt, to be able to take care of the baby, because that really would come first.
So what you're trying to say is that in life, that's the timeline, that if you have a regular obligation, Shema, 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 right? Twice a day, it's ticking over as we've already gone from the very, very first Mishnah in the first chapter. There's certain times when that's supposed to be happening, right? It's from this time to that time, morning, evening, or evening, morning, pick your way. That if another obligation coincides at that time, that you are exempt, right? That's what we found from the bridegroom, right? It's the time for the Shema and the time to rejoice with his bride, so you are exempt. And then you go through a whole bunch of regular days when everything is fine and normal and you're chayav, chayav, chayav. You have to do it, have to do it, have to do it, have to do it. And then you are carrying the funeral bier at the same time as another opportunity for the Shema, and you are exempt. And maybe a few days later, because it's been just a bad week in the village, you are now offering comfort to someone else who has buried somebody, and so you are exempt again. So at moments when you have either a conflict of obligation or an impossible expectation of concentration because of the circumstances, men, so far that we've discussed, are regularly exempt from the recitation of the Shema. Make sense so far? Okay. The parallel then between women, slaves, and minors are, this is their life. They are constantly in a state of another obligation. And because they exist in a state of constant obligation to do something else, they are not free to do the mitzvah of Shema, or indeed, in general, there are some exceptions to this, any time-bound positive commandment, any of the thou shalts that happen on a particular time or a particular schedule, the same category, women, slaves, and minors, are exempt from. We understand what that means, right? So then the question is, this was offering comfort, this was carrying the bier, this was my wedding night. What's this obligation? All right, well, let's try with some of the easiest ones we got here. You're a slave. I remember, you're an indentured servant. We're not talking about the chattel slavery of the American past. We're talking about the indentured servitude of the rabbinic times. You're a slave. So what's your blue line that's keeping you from having the opportunity to do these things?
Your time is not your own. And if at any moment your master says, get here, you can't say, excuse me, I'm saying, but we learned last week also that if the king goes by and says something to you and he might kill you if you don't answer, we can interrupt for that. But your master on a regular basis is not going to let his slave say, excuse me, I have something more important to do. You're not my real master. He is.
Although true, and although Judaism recognizes that the true master is the one who is the master of us all, while in this earthly existence, somebody who is enslaved in this form to a human master, their time is not their own, as you put it. They are on the clock, so to speak, 24/7. And at any moment, they could be called to perform a duty, and that would be difficult for them to then try to balance if they were not exempt. Remember, exempt doesn't mean forbidden. Right? Forbidden is a whole different word. It's asur. We're not talking about being forbidden from doing these things. We're talking about exempt from doing them. Remember our little picture? I need a bigger whiteboard. Our picture of the person who's in the below the line in debt. Right? It's basically saying at this moment your debt is canceled because of reasons. Right? There's something else happening that means this debt is no longer valid. It's no longer owing. Basically, the slave is given a free pass because he has this other set of obligations to his household that he serves. And so he is exempt from the Shema and these other things during that time period. Make sense? Okay. What about kids? Right? When we say minors, who are they? What's their obligation? What's this counterbalance that makes them exempt?
Well, they couldn't form the intention for saying this because they're too young to know what they're doing.
They're okay.
I mean, until bar mitzvah age, they're not even responsible for obeying the commandments. Their parents are responsible for them. I mean, I taught my 3-year-old to say the Shema, but I can't tell you that she understood what that was about. She could mouth the words.
Okay,
So-
and we're going to come back to that in just
Okay.
in just a minute. But there's a difference between they're exempt because they're incapable, because you could just as easily say a slave. You know, maybe he's never gotten an education, so, or maybe somebody who's completely free. You know, a freeman who was raised as an ignoramus, what's called an am haaretz within the text. Shouldn't he also be exempt until he learns? Right? Or do we say, I'm sorry, ignorance of the law is no excuse? Just because you don't know how to say the Shema doesn't mean the mitzvah doesn't apply to you. Just because you don't know how to keep fair books doesn't mean you're allowed to cheat your customers. And this may be a different concept than we have of modern child rearing, but children are essentially subject to their parents' whims. I'm sure you don't feel that way, but any teenager, just ask them, will absolutely feel like their parents are constantly making unreasonable demands upon them. And indeed, kids have an obligation to their parents when they are under the age of adulthood, that essentially puts them in a position where they are exempt from these other obligations. Right? And now let's get to the fun one. Right?
Okay.
Women. Is this the elephant in the room that no one wants to say? Right? We've got a pattern here, right? A slave is obligated to the whims of his master, and therefore is currently serving that and can't be expected, and is therefore exempt from these other time-bound mitzvot. And we're going to get to the counterbalance where they are not exempt, but at the moment, let's talk about the time ones. Kids are constantly at the whim of their parents, therefore they are exempt from these time-bound activities. Women.
Married women or unmarried women?
Women.
So one would assume married women are under the auspices of the husband, but an unmarried woman, also the parents, or why can't they say it? Why shouldn't they say it?
Well, no one said they shouldn't say it, and that's
Why
going to
should
be
they
very
be exempt? No, why
okay.
should-
And that should be, why should they be exempt? So to understand that, we have to understand ancient society, and this is very important for why within the conservative movement we have a different view of this calculation. In the ancient world, a woman was almost always attached to a household that had a male head. It was very, very rare, and usually a sign of tragedy and desperation if a woman did not have her life organized around some household that had at its peak a man, right? And that man might be, well, it would be basically in order, her father, when she was young, until she was married, and then it would be her husband. And if necessary, it might be a brother or some other relative if her husband died and she needed to re-affiliate with another household, or it might even be back to her father. And in fact, the text talks much about a woman returning to her father's home at the loss of her husband, right? So because of the way property ownership worked, and because of the way the economic structure of the ancient world worked, and then especially the inheritance rights, it meant that women were always expected to be under the rubric of a male head of household. And if he's the head of household and he gets to give orders to the people in the household, such as spin this wool, feed the chickens, take care of those kids, whatever it might be, she falls into the same category of having a perpetual state of obligation that could engage at any moment. And therefore, these specific time-bound activities, she is exempt. Now, does that mean she can't? Right. So Harry, you mentioned teaching a 3-year-old how to say the Shema.
Right.
But a 3-year-old is exempt.
Yes.
So does that mean a 3-year-old is not allowed to say the Shema?
Doesn't mean that you're not allowed, doesn't mean you don't have to.
Exactly right, which is why we educate 3-year-olds to say the Shema. Even though they are exempt and will be exempt until the age of the bar bat mitzvah, or where they become a bar bat mitzvah, we still teach them, we still have them practice it, and we still habituate them to coming to services, to davening on their own, and all the other activities that are necessary for adulthood while they are children. Precisely because we want them to be able to fulfill these obligations when they are chayav, when they are obligated to do so. So while they are exempt, they get to practice for when they are obligated. Well, for women, we have an unusual circumstance in the modern world, right? Because in the ancient world, essentially, a woman was always going to be on this blue line, which meant that she had a perpetual state of potential obligation that she could not ignore.
And to be fair, she could not make her own living. The women were not out working, earning money.
Absolutely. Well, no, they were working.
But not earning money in the same way.
And they were earning money, but the money was generally accruing to the estate. And the estate was owned by the male head of household, right? So it wasn't that a woman couldn't work, because they worked like dogs, just like men did. Yes. For all of our history, both genders had to constantly work to survive. It was that the value of their work was not their own. It was pooled as a resource for the household, and the household was headed by the person who would have the inheritance through, because most of that value accrued to the land. And land was passed by father, son, because of the tribal affiliation precedent, et cetera, et cetera. So women could have set out on their own, but very few people did well on their own, men or women, in the ancient world. I mean, the whole idea of having two people working together to make a family and a household is not just because it feels right, it's also a remarkably important survival technique if you are living in a pre-modern society, where you get salaries and paychecks and things like that, rather than having to grow the food out of the ground yourself. So in the modern world, however, we now have this remarkable change in our society, which is that women are no longer beholden 24/7 to the male head of household. No offense. Precisely not because women have rebelled, but because the society has changed to allow women to indeed be independent, to have their own red timeline, and to set their own schedule, and to be at the to have the same freedom and the same risks as men in providing for themselves. And indeed, many women are quite capable of living perfectly independent lives and being the master, or is it mistress, of their own destiny. And that's one of the underlying reasons why, since women were merely exempted in our Mishnah from this obligation because of the other obligation they had, when that other obligation disappears, the exemption disappears, which means women now become obligated. Yes, so this is the part that people get a little bit, oh, wait a minute. I thought it was that women could choose. No, women can, in really the strict interpretation of this, women can no more choose to be beholden to the mitzvot than a man can choose to be beholden to the mitzvot. If you are truly free, if you truly are the keeper of your own schedule and your own destiny, and you're not at the whim of someone else, then you are obligated to the mitzvot according to the regular schedule. It's the price, the privilege of being an equal person. And I personally think it's a wonderful price to pay. I was glad that I was born on the side that traditional Judaism always said was obligated, because I like the fact that I have these obligations. But in the modern conversation, new obligations are not always so celebrated. And so many women, and indeed many men view women's emancipation as an opportunity rather than an obligation, because it just sounds better. It looks better on the leaflet. But really, when women became emancipated, they became obligated to the mitzvot in an equal manner to the men. How are we doing with that? A little bit more. Wait, hold on.
Are women still obligated when they have babies they're taking care of?
They are as obligated as, well, we'll go back to the funeral side, right? Just as a person who has a deceased in front of them has an obligation that trumps other obligations, so too both a woman or a man that has the needs of a child in front of them has the obligation to take care of that child. So they are as obligated as their spouses. That is to say, well, I'll give you an example from later halakha, which I don't know if we're going to go over together, but you might as well know. If you are a father and you are standing in shul and you are in the midst of the Amidah and your 2-year-old son is standing next to you and he is going, Abba, 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 and everyone else around you is trying to do their Amidah. You're trying to do your Amidah, and when we get into chapter 4, we'll find out more about the intensity with which we daven the Amidah and that we're not supposed to be distracted and everything. You have an obligation to take care of your child, even though you are in the midst of your Amidah. Right? You don't ignore him and inflict that on everyone else in the community. You also don't ignore him because if there's a need, there's a need. So you would stop your Amidah, you would take care of the child, and then you would go back and daven the Amidah again.
Oh, sort of.
There's some variations on exactly where you are in it and such, but the general rule is yes, you would make up for what you had to interrupt. A woman would be responsible in the same way. So it's not that a woman is more responsible for the taking care of a child in order that her husband can be free to do these things, if they are truly equal. And I acknowledge that there are some households where it's not truly equal. There are some unspoken or sometimes spoken assumptions about whose responsibility it is to feed the kid at 2 a.m. And that, in my mind, means that there is still a presumption of male privilege. If you are truly equal, you can agree that one person will have certain responsibilities and the other person will have other responsibilities, but to simply assume it based upon gender is really to be eating away at the edges of what it means for women to be emancipated within our modern society. So yes, if you lived in a household where the woman did not have an expectation that her time was her own, but her husband expected her to take care of the kids, so he would be free to do more mitzvot, then yes, she would not be obligated to the mitzvot, just as this. Outside of the Orthodox world, I think having that kind of conversation between most modern men and women would probably be an awkward conversation. It might work out that the woman ends up with more obligations for the children than the man, or fulfilling the obligations of the children more often than the man fulfills the obligation of the children, but it can't be built into the relationship unless you are willing to accept that the relationship is inherently unequal. And if it's inherently unequal, then we're right back to the blue line. So does that make sense? Right? I know it's more radical than we're used to, because we still like traditional roles, and that's fine if everybody's agreeing to them. But it's a traditional role with agreement rather than a traditional role by coercion. And essentially there was a layer, no matter how nice and loving and caring these families were, there was a layer of coercion where a woman did not have the full freedom to express herself and choose her path the way a man did in the ancient world. And there may have been wonderfully appropriate social and economic reasons why that worked out, but it did put women in a subservient position. And if we don't want women to be in that subservient position, then we have to have a bit more of an awkward conversation now. Okay. But let's talk about the other half of this, right? Because everyone always focuses on the first half. Women, slaves, and minors are exempt from reciting the Shema and from putting on tefillin. No, by the way, they are exempt from putting on tefillin. Nowhere does it say women are prohibited from wearing tefillin. Even within traditional pre-modern society Jewish groups, there was no reason to prohibit a woman from either saying the Shema or from wearing tefillin. There were only cultural reasons why some communities did not approve of it or would condemn it. But they are obligated. Women are obligated, and slaves and minors, to the last 3 in the list. This is not an exhaustive list, by the way. There are other things they're obligated to as well. But this is an example. They are obligated to tefillah, the Amidah. They are obligated to the mezuzah, to having a mezuzah on the door, and they are obligated to Birkat HaMazon. Right? So you finish eating, and you're a woman, you are obligated to say the Birkat Hamazon, right? You are going through your day, and there is much debate about exactly how this works out. Women are obligated to do the Amidah. Even in the pre-modern communities, we're obligated to say the Amidah during the day. There was debate about whether they had to say it 3 times a day, or whether 1 time a day was enough, or whether they had to say the long version, or whether they could say abridged versions. But the idea that there was an obligation was universally accepted, as the Mishnah says. Women did have to daven the Amidah. Now, of course, with emancipation, women are equal and they get to say the Amidah 3 times a day, 4 times on Shabbat. Yay! Okay, any questions on this wonderfully famous Mishnah from chapter 3? Because this Mishnah is, as you see, tiny little words and has an entire history of 2,000 years hanging off of it, and many, many debates within the modern world. Up to and including the most recent debates about women ordination within what's called the Open Orthodox movement. There's a new group of Orthodox Jews that would like to allow women more authority and activity, and this Mishnah comes up in, well, how do you get around it? Right? That if a woman is exempt, we'll probably go to this later, but woman is exempt. If somebody is exempt from a mitzvah, they cannot perform it on behalf of another person, right? You can ride the coattails of the shaliach tzibor, of the person conducting services, if they are doing a mitzvah. That is to say, if they are fulfilling their obligation, you can ride their coattails by saying amen, and then you fulfill your obligation too. If they're not obligated, but are just saying the words, it doesn't count for them because they don't have the obligation, and it doesn't count for you, the person who's trying to ride their coattails. So if they're the leader of a community, how can you ride the coattails if the coattails don't exist? Because they're not really obligated. And that becomes a very big issue. Obviously, in the conservative movement, we obligate women, so there's no problem. They are obligated, and therefore we can ride them. The only group that's still an issue is minors, right? We couldn't have a 10-year-old be the voice leading the Amidah. They can help lead the Amidah, and indeed we have them help practice from the Bima many, many times, but they can't be the exclusive voice of the Amidah because they cannot fulfill our obligation on our behalf because they're not obligated yet because they're still too young. Did I just confuse everyone? Okay, we're going to go over that in more detail in a later Mishnah. Suffice it to say, chapter 3, Mishnah 3 still gets studied and argued about an awful lot. Okay, let's move on a little bit while we still have time.
Mishnah 4?
Mishnah 4.
One who has had a seminal emission.
Oh, if you were uncomfortable before. And by the way, I'm not doing diagrams for this.
Utters the words of the Shema in his heart, and he doesn't say a blessing neither before nor after.
And go ahead and finish this one off.
Over food, he says a blessing afterwards, but not the blessing before, except Rabbi Judah says he blesses both before them and after them.
Okay, so when there is a seminal emission, well, let's back up. Let's back up. Somebody who, according to the Torah, and you can see the citations in the introduction notes on the page. According to the Torah, someone who has a seminal emission is considered ritually impure for 1 day, right? For 1 day, right? From the time of Ezra, following the return of the Jews from Babylon and the reconstitution of the Jewish state and the re-entrenchment of Torah, there were a number of edicts that were established. And one of the ones that Ezra added was you don't read Torah while you are in this state of ritual impurity from the emission. So as the Shema is from the Torah, if you are into this category, you should not recite it. By the time of the Talmud, this decree was no longer enforced. Okay, during the time of the Mishnah, yes, it's still on the books. By the time we get a few hundred years later into the Talmud, nobody's actually following this. And it doesn't matter whether you had the emission last night or not, you are still going to say the Shema in the morning. And that becomes the normative practice. Before we come back to, well, wait a minute, what do you mean changed? If you're not saying the Shema, you don't say the blessings to go with it, because they hang from the Shema, right? The Shema is the main mitzvah, and her blessings are there because of her. Without her, the blessings go away as well. Remember, those are the blessings we talked about of creation and revelation and redemption. Remember the Yotzer Or and Ahava Rabbah and Geulah. And Birkat Hamazon is also what we call a deoraita. It is a Torah commandment. The blessing after is a Torah commandment. The blessing before is a rabbinic commandment. Therefore, the blessing after is the one that gets canceled. The blessing after is the one that doesn't get canceled because you need to say it, but the blessing before you shouldn't say in this state. Sorry, let me get that back around, right? Because the blessing before is less weighty in a sense. I know many people focus on the blessing before they eat, but that is an introduction. That's a prologue. The main course is the blessing after you eat. That's the one the Torah commanded us to do. The one before was a rabbinic innovation based upon logic, that if I'm going to bless afterwards, then all the more so I should bless before I eat when I'm still hungry. Because, it's even more desirous. I'm even more desirous of eating before I put the food in my mouth than I am after, depending upon what you ate. Okay. But where did it go? Right? Because I'm willing to bet that most men in the room, or most women for that matter, were not raised with their Hebrew school telling them that they need to be careful that if they, during the night, or in previous relations with their spouse, that the next day they're not doing the Shema and stuff. And then if they were invited up to read from the Torah, they'd have to say, no, I can't because last night I...
Right. And that would be embarrassing. We're not supposed to embarrass somebody. That's akin to murder.
Well, it's only...
But that would be very embarrassing to say, sorry, you don't know what I did last night, but I can't do it.
So it's not just that it's embarrassing, because technically there's nothing to be embarrassed about. It's a bodily function, and
It is, but we talk about them publicly.
But we don't. We don't. And indeed, this eventually loses its enforcement. This decree of Ezra is no longer implemented, and we don't check who is and who isn't. This becomes similar with regards to some of the other stringencies related to female conditions, where we also don't feel the need to check in the modern circumstances. That if we stopped checking for the guys, then not checking for the gals doesn't seem so unusual. It may have been that we stopped checking so long ago for the guys that we forgot we ever did check. But that doesn't mean that the precedent is not still a very good one when it comes to checking for things that are not essential. Right? There are still absolutely parts of the month when intimacy between husband and wife are prohibited because of the cycle. But that doesn't mean that one has to check what state a woman is in before you shake her hand, because that's not actually necessary. That may have been a stringency at some point, but it isn't a requirement of Jewish law. But that's more complicated. And should we ever get to the Tractate of Nida, we'll go into more detail on that point.
Isn't that why the Orthodox men won't shake a woman's hand? They don't even want to risk.
Some use that as an explanation, the issue of Nida, of the monthly cycle. Most actually use the explanation that to come into contact with a woman that isn't their spouse is an inappropriate advance. It's an inappropriately licentious contact. That would be akin to what someone outside that community might call groping. That it is titillating and stimulating, and I'm only supposed to be titillated and stimulated by my spouse. Therefore, I'm not going to touch another woman under those circumstances. So even if a woman was walking around with a big sign saying, don't worry, I just came from the mikveh, they still wouldn't shake hands. Okay. Sure. You know what? Let's go ahead and do 5 and 6 briefly, because they're not worth starting next week. And they deal with situations that are not very operative. But they're interesting, again, to talk about some of the nuances that we're going to see here.
Mishnah 5:1. If a man was standing saying tefillah, and he remembers that he is one who has had a seminal emission, he should not stop, but should abbreviate the blessings.
Right, and we're going to talk in chapter 4 about the different versions of the Amidah, that there's a long version and a short version and all of that. And the basic point is, if he goes, oh, that's right, last night, he's already started, finish it up with the short version and be done.
If he went down to immerse.
We're talking about going to the mikveh, right?
If he is able to come up and cover himself and recite the Shema before the rising of the sun, he should go up and cover himself and recite.
Now let's make sure we got this right. So you are right there at the end of the period for the Shema. When you jump into the mikveh and you come up and you're looking at the sun and you're going, okay, I got enough time. I can get up, put my bathrobe on. I'm okay. You should come up, put your bathrobe on, and then say the Shema.
But if not,
meaning there's no time. The sun is about to go right across, and if I don't say the Shema right now, I'm going to miss my mitzvah.
He should cover himself with the water and recite it.
Make sure that your neck, or more specifically your lower half, is submerged, and say the Shema while standing naked in the mikveh. You don't say the Shema while standing naked above ground, right? Because we don't say the Shema while naked, but the water is considered a barrier between the lower half and the upper half, and therefore it is permissible to be said while the lower half is still, in quote, unclothed, because it is, in quote, covered. Right? And if you think that sounds a little weird, right, just remember, we're all naked under our clothes. Right? So the water may not sound like much of a covering, but it is technically a covering. It is separating me from that exposure down there. So why not? If it's the difference between being able to do the mitzvah of Shema and not being able to do it, stay in the water and do the Shema right there where you stand, as long as you're at least waist deep. If you can get out and put on a robe, obviously that's preferred. Again, going all the way back to our very first mitzvah, there is the do or die moment of this will count, and then there is the but you should do it this way if you can. Okay, a little more.
He should not cover himself either with foul water or with steeping water until he pours fresh water into it.
Right, enough to make it not so foul. And steeping water, by the way, was the water that was used for flax preparation. Flax is the raw plant material used to make linen. Very, very important in the ancient world. Really, really a pain to iron, so it's not so popular nowadays. You don't see a lot of linens anymore for that reason. That's yay, synthetic fabrics.
And how far should he remove himself from it and from excrement? 4 cubits.
Which is not very far, but the whole point here is minimum distance, not maximum, in order to minimize the amount of time wasted if you're on the edge of the wire, right? I'm standing next to a dunghill, the sun's about to go down, I've got to move at least 4 cubits away. A cubit is about 18 inches, so we're talking about 6 feet here. At least 4 cubits away, then I can say the Shema. I can move farther if I've got the time, but if I move 4 cubits away, and again, it's the difference between doing or not doing, do it.
You said, for the last part, you said if the sun goes down, and for number 2, it was the sun coming up.
It's not the sun going down. Sorry, it's the sun moving.
Rising.
Yeah, the sun moving past the point which you're allowed to do it. So the sun can be coming up all the way at dawn, ruining the evening opportunity, or it can be going through the sky, ruining the morning's opportunity. Okay. So yes, the diagram would help of where you are in that window, but basically it's time is just about up.
Right.
And you should do the minimum and then be able to do the Shema. If you've got enough time, do it the better way. And trust me, being more than 6 feet away from dung, much better if you've got the time.
Yeah.
By the way, that becomes a very important principle when you live in a small apartment with a stinky baby, and with the diaper bin. If you're in a one-room apartment or so, it would be tricky to find a place more than 6 feet away, speaking to someone who lived in a Japanese apartment, from the diaper bin. Didn't have a baby at the time, thank God. This is a real concern in modern life. It's not just from the ancient world where you had farm animals. Humans can create all sorts of wonderful smells. Okay.
Wow.
Mishnah 6, end of chapter 3. Wow, we got all the way through it.
Yeah. 6. Yes. A Zav who has had a seminal emission and a Nida from whom semen escapes, and a woman who becomes Nida during intercourse require a mikvah, but Rabbi Judah exempts them.
All right, so as long as we're talking about emissions, we're just going to get a little aside here that has to do with the mikvah use. So you've had a seminal emission, or you are already in nida. That means right now you are already ritually impure. Right? You're already in a state of ritual impurity. And we don't have really time to go into this, but just a brief reminder, being in a state of ritual impurity doesn't make you bad. Right? This is not you're dirty or you're somehow foul. It's just a limit on certain activities that have to do with certain rituals of sanctity. That aside, you're already in a state of ritual impurity, and now something new happens, which puts you in a further state of ritual impurity. Well, generally speaking, you don't one up between impurity and more impurity. Right? It's not cumulative. The larger category of impurity is the one that takes precedent. However, the Chachamim say a Zav, which is somebody who has an irregular discharge, a man who has an irregular discharge, has to go to the mikveh. Even though he's already ritually impure, so going to the mikveh is not going to make any difference. And even though as a Zav, you're going to have to wait a number of days of no sign of further discharge before he can go to the mikveh to clear up that ritual impurity, he's already slated for the mikveh, you have to go, right? Going to the mikveh while ritually impure, even when you step out of the mikveh, you will still be ritually impure, sometimes is required, is what the rabbis are saying here, right? People often make a very big deal about you're not allowed to go to the mikveh unless you're already ritually pure. If you couldn't go to the mikveh unless you were ritually pure, you could never go to the mikveh, because that's what the mikveh is meant to do, right? You are ritually impure until you emerge from the mikveh. And even if you're going to emerge still ritually impure, because the condition that made you ritually impure was still occurring, you still, under certain circumstances, have to go. Right? And that's what's being discussed here. All right, so never let anyone tell you you can't use the mikveh. Right? This is very, very important, especially in some places where there are guards on the mikveh that can be asking, to go back to our earlier question, embarrassing questions. You can always use the mikveh. It may or may not have the desired effect ritually. Just because you used it doesn't mean you come out ritually pure if it wasn't exactly the right time to use it. But you've done nothing wrong. You haven't damaged the mikveh by going while ritually impure, because everyone who goes in the mikveh is ritually impure, or else they wouldn't be in need of it. Okay? Okay. I think that's it for tonight.
Wow.
Okay, we did it in an hour, even though we started 10 minutes late. So we got our money's worth.
Yes.
All right. Let me just hit close here. Come on, wake up. Stop broadcast.